Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 6 through 11 in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. Remember, in Genesis chapters 1 through 5, we saw what we called creation history, and we noted that we started with Adam and Eve, and then we looked in chapters 4, verses 1 through 16, where we had Adam's sons, and there we could have seen the technological development of mankind. It's alluded to in the latter part of chapter 4, where you have one person who's the father of all who work in iron. That doesn't mean the Iron Age has already started, but in other words, all of those sorts of things, metalworking and so on, those things began to take place, as well as music, as well as people living in tents. A number of developments begin in that early era. We can look at 10 generations then, beginning with Adam and coming all the way to Noah, and then we're going to see somebody with 3 sons, but there's 10 generations that are described. Now, as we come to chapters 6 through 11, we're going to look at the history of Noah and his sons and his descendants. We'll be focusing first on Noah, then he's going to have 3 sons, not just 2 like that. Well, actually, Adam has 3 sons, Cain and Abel, but Cain kills Abel, and then he has Seth. 3 that are mentioned. Yeah, there are other sons as well. Noah has 3 sons, again, that are mentioned. And what we have following that is what we could call the ethnic development of mankind. That is, we're going to be seeing the nations come forth, and that will be the story that's given in Genesis chapter 10. And just as we had 10 generations from Adam to Noah, we're going to see 10 generations from Noah to Terah, who will be the father of Abraham. We'll come to a close and look at that very briefly. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we read that now it came about when men began to multiply in the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Now that phrase, sons of God, the Hebrew is B'nai Elohim, has caused a bit of a controversy among scholars. There are 2 popular, and I'm going to really suggest 3 different interpretations of this phrase, and it's going to have give some different meanings to the text as a result. Let's just get the rest of the context. Chapter 6, verse 3, Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Now, that's not saying that the lifespan of man is now going to be reduced to a mere 120 years. If we look at the average lifespan in Adam and his sons, the average seems to be around 900 years. Very, very high statement of lifespan. And this isn't saying, now it's going to lower after the flood, but I don't think this is a statement of that. Rather, I would suggest this is a prophecy that within 120 years, the end of man is going to come, exception being Noah and his family, that the flood is about to come, and we're going to see that further developed as we read through the rest of Genesis chapter 6. Verse 4 says, the Nephilim. Now, depending on your point of view, the Nephilim, and notice that the translators weren't quite sure what to do with it. The translators here of the New American Standard Version, if we were reading this in the King James Version, it would have said there were giants on the earth in those days. That's one possible translation of the Nephilim. The New American Standard translators weren't sure what to do with it, so they just left the Hebrew word there untranslated. The Nephilim. Literally, it means the fallen ones. But who were these fallen ones? These Nephilim, were they giants indeed, as the King James Version has rendered that word? They were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God, here's again a reference to the sons of God, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those seems to refer to those whom they bore, although I guess you could say no, those refer to either the sons of God or those Nephilim, whoever. But those were the mighty men who were of old men of renown. Now, one possible interpretation of this phrase "sons of God," and we've seen the surrounding verses, so we see how that's used. One possible interpretation has this referring to angels, not angels from heaven, but rather fallen angels. The writings of Josephus seem to support this interpretation. Well, doesn't seem to support. Josephus does say this. He supports this interpretation. He says when he's giving the same history, and he says there came a time when there were fallen angels, and they came in and they took human wives, and the result was some sort of fallen ones, and as a result, God brought about the flood. It's also true that when we read the same phrase, "sons of God," Ben Elohim, we see it used several other times in the Bible. First of all, in Job chapters 1 and 2, and again in Job chapter 38 and verse 4. In all three of those indications, it seems to be a reference to angels. In Job chapters 1 and 2, you have the sons of God that are coming into the presence of God, and Satan shows up also. And that doesn't seem to take place too often here on earth, where we come into the presence of God and Satan shows up and there's a conversation between Satan and God. That seems to be more than meets the eye, especially when we get to Job chapter 38 verse 4, and God is speaking of what there was at the creation when all the sons of God shouted for joy. And there again, it would seem to be, it doesn't use the term angels, but it seems to be that this might be a reference in at least that passage, at least in the book of Job, to angels. Now, it can be argued, wait a minute, angels don't marry. Jesus actually said angels they don't marry, they're not given in marriage. And indeed, when we are risen from the dead, we won't marry or be given in marriage either. That's the point that he's making when he says that. And yet we could argue, in defense of this position, that angels in heaven, it's true, don't marry, but these angels were not in heaven. These were fallen angels, and so we could say maybe all bets are off. The resulting offspring, according to the theory at least, now it's not entirely clear from the passage, but one possible interpretation of the passage is that the resulting offspring produced giants. What do you get when you have an angel and a human wife and giant? Well, the passage isn't quite so clear whether they were giants or whether that was even the offspring. So that's interpretive, highly interpretive. This interpretation might seem to be supported both in the apocryphal book of Enoch. There I think it is supported. I think Josephus is actually getting his interpretation from the book of Enoch. And perhaps Jude 6 is an allusion to that, although that's not quite so necessary. So Jude 6 cannot be argued as being definitive in that argument, but perhaps it could be used as just an added point of support. Now the second interpretation, again a very common one, would see the sons of God referring to the descendants of Seth. Remember, Adam and Eve had Cain, and then they had Abel, who was killed by Cain, and then they had another son, they had Seth. And this view sees the sons of God referring to the descendants, the seed of Seth. Now, I think this is perhaps supported by the context, because the preceding chapters 4 and chapter 5, each contain a genealogy. Chapter 4 follows the line of Cain. Chapter 5 follows the line of Seth, which would make you think that we're still talking about that. And so the preceding chapters set forth the contrast of these two lines, and this would be seen as a continuation, a contextual continuation of that idea. Chapter 4, toward the end, states that there came a time when men began to call on the name of the Lord, and that could be a reference to the fact that now they are being called sons of God. Thirdly, we should note that when we see the description of the flood, it is mankind that is punished in the flood. There's no further reference to sons of God or angels or any of that. It's merely mankind that is punished in the flood. Fourthly, we ought to note that sonship is a common theme in not just the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well, to refer to God's people. God often speaks of Israel as his son. Finally, we ought to note that the idea of marriage of the godly seed to ungodly people is also a common theme in Genesis. For example, when we see Ishmael, and then later on Esau, and then others taking for themselves wives who did not believe in the Lord. That's a common theme in the book of Genesis. So it should not surprise us that it is here as well. A third view, much more recent in origin, is that the sons of God refer to certain kings and rulers. Now, this view was espoused, like I said, just in the last 60, 70 years. It's a fairly recent view. The Aramaic interpretation, and indeed the Aramaic language, just the way you might render the Hebrew if you were sort of thinking in Aramaic, tends to lend itself to this interpretation. And it's true that the term Elohim does refer on a few occasions to human judges. For example, Exodus chapter 21 verse 6, also Exodus chapter 22 verses 8 and 9, as well as Psalms 82 and verses 1 and 6. There are those few indications where the term Elohim refers to the strong one, that is the judge, the one who's sort of in charge, the ruler, not necessarily, doesn't have to be a king, but the mighty one. That's what the term can mean. There is a similar usage to this in the Babylonian texts. Indeed, it was through the study of those texts and then coming back and looking at the biblical texts that some scholars wondered perhaps that is really the meaning of Genesis chapter 6. And it's true that kings were often referred to as Elohim in the East, because they thought of their kings in terms of being a god. Remember, if you go down to Egypt, one of the gods that was worshipped was the Pharaoh. The actions that we see here of men taking wives are paralleled in the story of Lamech, the seventh in line after Cain, mentioned in Genesis chapter 4, who goes out and takes two wives for himself. He's the first polygamist who's actually mentioned as being such, takes for himself two wives and then murders a man, and then he's bragging about it in Genesis chapter 4. Finally, we already noted that the term Nephilim, it actually refers to the fallen ones. That's a very literal translation. Now, can it refer to big fallen ones, giants? I suppose that it could, and elsewhere it very well might, but the term itself refers to fallen ones. That's what the term means. In any case, we continue reading in Genesis, and God approaches Noah, and in Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, Noah is told, "Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood." Now, the word ark, the Hebrew word tiba, is the same word which is used for the ark into which the baby Moses was placed. Now, it's not a word that means boat. It is a word that means box or treasure chest, and it might be a big giant treasure chest like the one that Noah is going to make, or it might be a little tiny treasure chest like the one into which Moses as a baby was placed. Remember, he's placed there in an ark on the Nile River and found by the daughter of the Pharaoh. And so likewise, Noah is told to make for himself a big giant, when we see the dimensions it is going to be quite large, an ark of gopher wood. Now, we don't know what gopher is. The translators don't know what gopher is. So what they did is they did the same thing they did with the word Nephilim. They just put the Hebrew word with English letters, gopher, whatever that is, certain type of wood apparently. You shall make the ark with rooms and shall cover it inside and outside. Our translation says with pitch. Actually, I like the Hebrew better, where it says, "Ye shall cover it inside and outside with covering." This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. I don't think we've talked yet about what a cubit is in this class. A cubit was the length from your fingertip to your elbow. roughly about 18 inches. Now, if you went to Babylon, they had what they called a royal cubit. As you can imagine, the king wanted everybody to think he was bigger than everybody else. So the royal cubit was a couple inches longer. But we're going to go with roughly about 18 inches, which means that the ark of 300 cubits, as we read here, we can think of it as about 450 feet, give or take. So the length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, translate that to 75 feet wide, and its height, 30 cubits, again, translate that to about 45 feet high. So that's a huge structure. It is a structure, remember we just said that the word Teba describes a box. It is a structure that looks a bit like an ocean-going barge. I've had the opportunity to work for a number of years in my younger years within a seaport. And one thing I saw a lot of were barges. And these are the typical dimensions that you see in an ocean-going barge. Very sturdy, doesn't rock a lot. And that's what's described here in this passage. Now, when we look at the structure of chapters 6 through 9, I want you to notice the parallelism that is given here. We begin with Noah's 3 sons in chapter 6, verse 10, they're mentioned. And then in verse 18, we see God entering into a covenant with Noah. We'll come back in a bit and speak about that covenant idea. This is the first time that word is used in the Bible, the idea of the covenant. And in that covenant that's made with Noah, God promises to destroy the earth with a flood. That's not part of the covenant. He says, I'm going to make you a covenant with you, and the reason I'm making it with you is because I'm going to destroy the earth with the flood, and you won't be destroyed in that. And then there's the command to take food. That's in chapter 6, verse 21. Then Noah and his family enter the ark in chapter 7, verse 1. And chapter 7, verse 11, all the way to chapter 8, 13, are a description of all the events of the flood. And then when we come to chapter 8, verse 14, we have Noah and his family. They finally come out of the ark. Notice in chapter 7, verse 1, they went in. Now in chapter 8, verse 14, they went out. They go out. Notice how back in chapter 6, verse 21, there had been a command to take food. Now they're given again a command regarding food, and this time the command is don't eat blood when you take an animal and kill it. You're allowed to do that, but drain the blood. Don't be eating the blood. Back in chapter 6, verse 18, there had been a promise of a covenant. God said, I'm going to make a covenant with you. Now he actually enters into that covenant in chapter 9, verses 8 through 17, where God establishes a covenant with Noah. And here the promise is not to destroy the earth with a flood. Back in chapter 6, the promise was that he was going to destroy the earth with a flood. Now the promise is that he will not destroy the earth with a flood. And we come finally to chapter 9, verse 18, which culminates this whole section, where again there's a mention of Noah's 3 sons. Now what I want to do is look at this central part, the part that deals with just the flood on the earth, and we're going to see that section too is in the same sort of format. By the way, this is called a chiastic format. It's a chiasm that has corresponding points on the beginning and end, and they work their way toward the middle. And as we open up just this section dealing with the flood on the earth, it is going to do exactly the same thing. So it's a chiasm within a chiasm. Let's do that. In chapter 7, verses 15 and 16, we see how the Lord shuts the door and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, the flood's going to be much longer than that. That's just the flood, the waters that come upon. It's raining for that many days and nights. And then we continue to see in verses 18 through 20 that the waters increase until the mountains are covered. So the increase continues for another 150 days. And that's what we see in verses 21 through 24. 150 days, the waters prevail. Finally, in chapter 8 and verse 1, this is the pivotal point of the entire chiasm within the chiasm, where God remembers Noah, and now God is, instead of bringing destruction, he's going to bring deliverance. He's kept them alive through the ark, but now he's going to remove the water from the earth. We see that in chapter 8, verse 3, where for 150 days, corresponding to the 150 days where the waters prevailed, now for 150 days the waters abate. They begin to go back. The waters decrease until the mountains become visible. That's chapter 8, verses 4 and 5. And finally, at the end of the 40 days, Noah opens the window. Now, God had shut the door back in chapter 7, verse 15 and 16. Now, Noah opens the window. He looks, can't see very much, and so he's going to send out those birds. First the doves, actually first a raven, and then the doves are sent out. And finally, the ark is going to land on a certain mountain in the land of Ararat. So we have this completed idea. Notice the chiasm within the chiasm. So now that Noah's family, they come out of the ark, and there's a command not to eat blood, and God enters into his covenant with Noah. Now, in the 7th month, this is chapter 8, verse 4, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. The ancient world knew this place as Urartu. Our biblical text calls it Ararat, same name for the same place. If we look at a map, that area is located to the north of Mesopotamia, near the headwaters of both the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Ararat, and it's not. We're not speaking of a single mountain in Ararat. That's not the name of the mountain. It's true if you go to Turkey today, eastern Turkey, and you pay a guide, they'll actually take you to a mountain. They'll say that's Mount Ararat. It might or might not be, but the biblical text doesn't say that the ark landed on the mountain of Ararat. It was rather it landed on a certain mountain in the land of Ararat, in that general vicinity, in that general land. And then verse 8, then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, Now, behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you, and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth, so that the covenant that God makes is not merely with Noah, it's not merely with Noah and his family, but it is with all living things. Now, that brings up a question. What is a covenant? A covenant includes, when I ask this question, some people say, well, there are promises in a covenant, and there are. There are agreements in a covenant. When we think of a marriage covenant, there are certain promises and agreement. There's a relationship that binds us, and those are all parts of a covenant. But there's another part that is often overlooked in a covenant. A covenant contains a curse. That is, when you would enter into a covenant, the formula that you would use is you would take an animal and you would kill the animal. I know this sounds sort of gory, but you would take the dead animal and then you would actually cut it into 2 parts. And you would pass between the parts of the covenant. And what you were saying is that if I do not keep my promise, the promises of the covenant, then may what happened to that animal, may that also happen to me. So that a covenant put a curse on the one making the covenant if he broke it. Now, if he doesn't break it, the curse doesn't get applied. In fact, what he gets is blessings. But a covenant, therefore, we can call it an agreement, we can call it a contract, but it's really much stronger than that. God makes a covenant with Noah and his descendants, and with every living creature on the face of the earth. This is a universal covenant that God makes with all life on planet Earth. He says in verse 11, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the world. That is the promise of the covenant. Now, God doesn't say that he will never again destroy the world, but he will never again do it with a flood. Well, we read that Noah began farming and planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. That's not a very noble sort of thing. Verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, and as we're reading this, we ought to remember to whom this is being written. This is being written by Moses to the Israelites. Now, it takes place long, long before Moses was ever born, but he is writing it He's the author of this. I take him as the author, writing it to the Israelites who were in the wilderness, and they are soon going to be going to the land of Canaan. So as they read the name Canaan, suddenly they perk up and take interest. And here, Ham, the father of Canaan, because that's going to come into our story, Ham saw the nakedness of his father and told his brothers outside. So he seems to take his father's condition, which wasn't all that much of a noble condition, but he takes his father's condition and he brings dishonor upon his father. In an honor and shame culture, that was a terrible thing. By contrast, we see how both Shem and Japheth took a garment, they laid it upon both their shoulders, and they walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. They're taking his shame and covering it so that it is not apparent for anybody else. They won't even look with their own faces. In fact, we read that their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. They act in an honorable way toward their father, in contrast to Ham, who had acted in a dishonorable way. Now when Moses awoke, this is verse 24, when Moses awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. His youngest son had dishonored him. And so he said, and this is a prophecy that will be played out throughout the rest, not just of the book of Genesis, but throughout the rest of the entire Bible. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brother." I find that translation just a bit too tame. Literally, cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves he shall be to his brother. When you want to emphasize something, you say it twice, and certainly there is an emphasis here. And it is not Ham that is cursed, it is Canaan. Remember to whom this is being written. This is being written to those who are about to go into the land of Canaan, and they will be bringing God's judgment against Canaan, not just for this thing that had happened way back when, but for their own current sins. So this is going to be played out in their lives. A slave of slaves he shall be to his brothers, but the prophecy does not end there. He also said, "Blessed be the God of Shem." Now it is going to be from Shem that we're going to see eventually Abraham and the Jewish people. In fact, that's why we speak of the Semitic people. It comes from that word Shem. Folks that are against Jewish people, we call them anti-Semitic. "Blessed be the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant," or his slave. But then in verse 27, here's another interesting part to this prophecy. "May God enlarge Japheth." Now there's a play on words there. He's actually, because the word Japheth the name Japheth actually means to enlarge. So may God enlarge the enlarged one, may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant or his slave. Now, as we said, when there's a play on, actually there's several plays on word here. First of all, when he says let him enlarge, let him Japheth, let him enlarge Japheth, let him enlarge the enlarged one, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. And this brings up the question: to whom does the pronoun him refer? Most folk, especially even the translators here, because notice how the him is not capitalized, most folk have taken this to be a reference to Japheth, how somehow Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem. And scholars have gone through all sorts of contortions, and that's exactly what it has been, to try to explain in what way Japheth dwells in the tents of Shem. It absolutely makes no sense. However, the subject of the sentence is not Japheth. He's the object. The subject of the sentence is God. May God enlarge the enlarged one. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him. I want to suggest that it's not Japheth that is in view in the hymn, but rather it is speaking of God. Let God dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. You see, that takes place very literally in the days in which Moses is writing this book to the Israelites. They have left Egypt. They are now in the wilderness. They've come to Mount Sinai. They've been given the instructions for building the tabernacle. And as Moses writes this, I can sort of imagine him sitting in his tent. All he has to do is look outside, and there's a much bigger tent in the middle of the camp. And indeed, the presence of God is dwelling in the tents of Shem. He's dwelling among them. He's even got his own tent there. And so this is a promise that God would be with his people. And in the days of Moses, as he is writing this, it has taken place before their eyes. We started talking about, in fact we discussed this last week, this contrast between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and we noted how physically both Cain and Abel and even Seth, they were all physically the seed of the woman, and yet we saw how that Cain had been very serpent-like in his spiritual nature. He had murdered his brother, and then there's a genealogy to follow, how that his descendants walked in the same path, that they, spiritually speaking, seemed to look like the seed of the serpent. And then we saw by contrast how the seed of the woman continues first through Abel and then through Seth, and that goes down 7 generations to Enoch, who walks with God, and we go all the way down to Noah, who finds grace in the eyes of the Lord and is saved from the flood through the ark. And that seed of the woman continues all the way to Shem. It's finally going to come to Abraham before we're done. But we also suggested that the seed of the serpent was seen in the person of Ham, and that is passed down specifically to one of his descendants, not necessarily to all of them, but to one of them, and that is Canaan, where Canaan has a curse put upon him. And we're going to see when we finally look at the Canaanites, all the way in the book of Joshua, that indeed they play out the part very well, where they are acting very serpent-like. They are wanting nothing to do with the Lord. That is, they're worshiping false gods and a false religious system, and they're engaging in human sacrifice and lots of other bad things. And they are completely given over to the seed of the serpent. By contrast, now we're going to move toward Abraham, but before we do, we need to talk about the Tower of Babel. In Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, we read that the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Shinar is another word for what we call Mesopotamia, and they settled there. So here they are. They're coming down. If you're coming from Ararat, you're going straight south. But they probably move to the west first, because you're always following the water system, and then they come toward the east down into the plain of Shinar, and they're going to build a city which will be called Babel. Now we hear it here called Babel. Later on in the Bible, we're going to read of Babylon. When I look at the Hebrew text, it will be exactly the same spelling. But for one reason or another, the translators have chosen to call it Babel here in Genesis chapter 11, and everywhere else in the Bible they call it Babylon. Same place. It is the same place. Verses 3 and 4, they said to one another, "Come, let us," notice the plural pronoun, "let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used bricks for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered." They're very much in what they want. No mention made of what God wants. So it's a very self-centered approach, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. This was to be a unifying monument, a unifying city. And they build the city, they set out to build the city and the tower, whose top, notice the words "will reach into heaven." The word "will reach" is actually italicized. I'm not sure they were trying to get this ladder that would get all the way up into heaven, but rather its top was dedicated and had to do with the heavens. And we know from secular history that those in that land often engaged in building temple towers. We know them as ziggurats. We have here an artist's conception of a Mesopotamian ziggurat. It would have a huge stairway leading to the top, where on top, its top would be dedicated to the worship of false gods in the heavens, and there'd be astrological symbols and those sorts of things. A friend of mine was actually in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, a number of years back, and he was a chaplain, and he sent me this photo. I don't know if he had taken it or somebody else had taken it, of the ziggurat of Ur. It's a ziggurat that has been reconstructed as it looked I'm not sure if it's entirely finished. You can see an airplane sort of flying in the background. As it's been reconstructed to how it would have looked in ancient times. I imagine the Tower of Babel was built much along the same way. Notice they don't use the big stones like you have in the Great Pyramids, because there aren't a lot of those nearby. Instead, they're using brick instead of stone. And so this is built of brick. And God comes and confuses the language, and because he confuses it, its name is called Babel. This is a play on words. It's called Babel because there the Lord balaled. He confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. And so from this point on, mankind is scattered because of the diversity of language. Now, that doesn't mean he made English and French and German all at that time. Those languages have developed over time. But if you speak to any philologist, in fact, the first place I ever read about this was in H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It's a really, really old book, who in his day, philologists, were looking at three major language groups. They referred to Indo-European, that is, those of the descendants of Japheth, although Wells wasn't giving it that title, but Indo-European, and then there are the Semitic languages, and then there are those that Wells referred to back then as the Hamitic languages. Nowadays they have those languages further diversified, but still we see those three major roots, and it might be that the original language were those three, and that all languages have developed from those. In closing, I want to note, and we referenced this already, that in Genesis chapter 5 we have a genealogy, and you begin with Adam, and it goes through Seth, all the way down 10 generations, all the way to Noah, who has 3 sons, and all of the rest of the world is going to be populated from those 3 sons. In Genesis chapter 11, that we just looked at, the Tower of Babel, again we have a genealogy. It starts with Noah, where we left off, and it goes specifically through one of those sons, through Shem, 10 generations, all the way down to Terah, who likewise has 3 sons. Now, this suggests that these 2 genealogies are specifically stylized to present a very specific pattern. The number 10 is significant to the writer of Genesis. Remember, there's 10 plagues and 10 commandments and 10 other things. So here, likewise, there are 10 generations in the first genealogy, 10 generations in the second genealogy, and it is ordered, I believe, deliberately, even if that means leaving names out here and there. The same sort of thing is seen when you look at the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, where that genealogy isn't referenced in numbers of 10, but rather in numbers of 14, and the passage very specifically says, so there's 14 generations from Abraham all the way to David, and from David to the Babylonian captivity, and from Babylonian captivity to the end. And that's done for a specific reason. It's done and we know that actually certain names were left out deliberately. It's not that the writer of Matthew doesn't know about those. He deliberately leaves out some names so that he can have this stylized genealogy, and it would appear that the same thing is happening here in Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 11, which means that we ought to take care not to merely just try to add up all the begats and the years that are mentioned there, to try to get to the date of creation. I think that is a misguided attempt. I have a feeling that creation took place maybe a long time earlier than that. I can't really say, I wasn't there. But these are stylized genealogies. So we should not use the genealogy in that way. Notice finally, and we'll make this our final point, from Adam to Noah and his 3 sons, it's there that we see, yes, destruction, but we see the salvation of the whole world, such as it was. That is, all mankind is destroyed, except for Noah and his 3 sons, and salvation comes, continuing the human race, comes through them. Likewise, we go from Noah to Terah, who has 3 sons, and it will be through one of his sons, through Abraham, that will come forth the one who will be the blessing to the whole world, who will be the Savior of the whole world, and I'm speaking of no one less than Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the Son of Abraham. In him we trust.